There are cities that never sleep. Cities where the lights never go dark, where the music never stops, and where the wrong people hold all the right power. Cities where a man's word is worth more than any law ever written. Cities where the police know certain names and choose, very carefully, never to say them out loud. Cities where power doesn't wear a uniform or carry a badge. It wears a suit. It sits in the back of a black car. It orders expensive drinks it never finishes, and makes decisions that change lives without raising its voice once. And in one of those cities, there was one man whose word was the only law that mattered. His name was Han Soo-Hyun. He was 34 years old, tall, still, the kind of man whose face gave nothing away, not because he was empty, but because he had trained himself, over years and hard lessons, to keep everything locked behind his eyes where no one could read it. He had dark hair that he never styled, because he didn't need to. He had hands that were always calm, even when everything around him wasn't. He dressed well without trying to impress anyone, because impressing people had never been the point. Control was the point. Stability was the point. Making sure that every moving piece in his world stayed exactly where he put it. That was the point. And tonight, something had gone wrong. Boss. We found him. The driver said it quietly, the way people always spoke around Soo-Hyun. Not from fear exactly, though fear was part of it. More from a kind of careful respect. The understanding that this man did not need volume. That things said softly in his presence landed harder than things shouted anywhere else. Where? Not a question. A command. Flat and clean as a blade. In Chan, one of the harbor clubs near the port. Soo-Hyun said nothing for a moment. He sat in the back of the car, with his hands resting on his knees, and his eyes on the city passing outside the window. Rain was coming down in sheets, bending the neon reflections across the wet pavement into something beautiful and wrong. He watched it without really seeing it. His mind was already somewhere else. Already in that club. Already in that room. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. Because a man who screams is a man who's losing control. A man who shouts is a man who needs the room to know he's in charge, which means he isn't sure that they do. Soo-Hyun had never needed the room to know anything. The room always already knew. He had been 17 years old when he first understood what it meant to have presence. He had walked into a room full of men twice his age, men who had been doing this for decades, men who looked at him and saw a boy playing at something he didn't understand. He had sat down. He had listened. He had said 4 sentences. And when he left, the deal was done. Not because of what he said. Because of how he said nothing. That was the night everything began. And Han Soo-Hyun had never lost control of anything. Not since the night he took everything. He had built his empire the hard way. Not with inheritance. Not with connections handed to him at birth. Not with luck. Though people who didn't know better liked to say that luck had something to do with it, because it was easier than accepting that some people are simply better at this than others. He had built it with silence, with patience, with an ability to walk into any room and within minutes understand exactly who held the real power, who was pretending, who was afraid, and who was dangerous. He had built it by being the person in every negotiation who wanted it less, or at least appeared to, by being the person who could stand up and walk away, and mean it, when everyone else at the table needed the deal too badly to do the same. He had started with nothing but a name no one feared. Now, the name alone ended conversations. There were men in this city who had been doing this for 30 years, who stepped aside when Soo-Hyun walked into a room. Not because they were told to, because something in the way he moved told them, without a word, that it was the right thing to do. He had never asked for that. He had simply become something that made it happen naturally. He was untouchable in every room that mattered. and in the rooms that didn't matter. He was something else entirely. The man who ran. His name was Park Dae-young, 26 years old. Sharp eyes, a mouth that smiled too easily, the kind of smile that looks like warmth but is really just strategy. Soo-Hyun had noticed that about him from the beginning. Had noticed it and filed it and decided it didn't matter, because the boy was smart and fast and had a talent for moving through complicated situations without leaving a mark. That was useful. That was worth something. He had brought Dae-young in 3 years ago on the recommendation of someone he trusted, had given him a low-level position at first, the kind of work that tested loyalty without risking too much. Dae-young had handled it cleanly. So Soo-Hyun had given him more, and more after that, and more after that. Because that was how trust was built. Slowly. In layers. Each layer tested before the next one was added. 3 years. 3 years of being given access, of being let inside, of being trusted with things that could not be untrusted. And then one morning. 400 million won. Gone. Not misplaced. Not delayed. Gone. Moved through accounts that had been set up carefully over weeks. Accounts Dae-young had access to through a position Soo-Hyun had given him personally. It was clean work. Careful work. The kind of work that took planning and time and a very particular kind of nerve. Soo-Hyun had sat at his desk and looked at the numbers for a long time. Not because he didn't understand them. He understood them immediately. He sat with them because he wanted to be absolutely certain before he did anything. He wanted to make sure there was no other explanation. No error. No misunderstanding. There wasn't. A drawer closed. Silence followed. Not just money. Because when a man like Soo-Hyun is stolen from, it is never just about the money. The money is replaceable. 400 million won is significant. But it is not the kind of number that changes anything for a man with his resources. He could absorb the loss without blinking. That was not the point. The point was what the theft said. What it communicated to every person in his organization who would eventually hear about it. And they would all hear about it. Because things like this always came out. It says he is weak. It says he can be fooled. It says that if you are clever enough and patient enough, you can take from Han Soo-Hyun and walk away. And in his world, that kind of message gets people killed. Not because he was cruel. He had never thought of himself as cruel. He was precise. There was a difference. Cruelty is personal. What he did was structural. It was about maintaining an architecture that kept everyone inside it safe, including the people who worked for him, including the people who depended on that structure holding. When someone stole from the organization had to respond. Not out of anger. Out of necessity. He had understood this for a long time. He drove toward the port district without speaking again. The rain kept coming. The city kept moving. Somewhere in a harbor club near the water, Park Dae-young was sitting with a drink he thought he had earned. Sitting there believing, somehow, that he had gotten away with it. The club sat on the edge of the port district, where the city's glamour ran out, and something rawer took its place. Down here the signs were older, the lights were cheaper, the music was louder than it needed to be. There was an energy to the port district that the rest of the city pretended didn't exist. A hunger that operated just below the surface of everything, visible if you knew how to look. It was the kind of place where people came to be invisible, where names didn't matter, and faces were forgotten by morning. The kind of place where a man running from something might think he was safe. He wasn't. The car stopped half a block from the entrance. Soo-Hyun stepped out without waiting for the driver. The rain hit him immediately, but he didn't react to it. He walked toward the club entrance at an even pace, 2 of his men falling in behind him without being told. He walked in like he owned it. Because men like him walk into every room that way. Not with arrogance. Not with performance. just with the settled, absolute certainty of a man who has never needed to announce himself. A few heads turned just inside the door. Just for a second. Something about him commanded the eye without demanding it, the way certain things do. The way a fire does, or a storm. Not because it is trying to be noticed, because it simply is what it is, and everything around it responds accordingly. No announcement. No drama. Just the quiet shift in the air that happens when real power enters a space. And everyone in that room felt it, even if they didn't know why. He's here. Find him. Already on it, boss. The guards dispersed into the crowd with the practiced ease of men who had done this many times before. Soo-Hyun didn't follow them. He stood near the entrance and let his eyes move slowly across the room. It was a large space, low-lit and loud, the kind of place that was designed to make you feel like the night could go anywhere from here. He didn't move like a man hunting. He stood at the edge of the room and let it come to him. That was always how he did it. Movement draws attention, and attention narrows your options. Stillness gives you information. Stillness lets you see the whole picture before you choose which part of it to touch. He was still. And then his eyes moved. Not because someone signaled him, not because of anything his men did or said, but because something caught him. Something he hadn't expected. The stage was at the far end of the room, a raised platform with a single warm spotlight cutting down through the dimness. He saw her because the light found her, and once it did, everything else in the room became background. She wasn't the kind of beautiful that demands to be noticed. She wasn't performing for the room the way most performers do, leaning into the audience, seeking their response, feeding off it. She moved like she was somewhere else entirely. Like the music was something only she could hear fully, something the speakers were only approximating. Like the room was a backdrop she happened to be standing in front of, not a stage she was trying to own. She was completely and utterly self-contained, and in a room full of people performing versions of themselves. That was the most striking thing Soo-Hyun had ever seen. The way the light landed on her collarbone. The way her hands moved like she was conducting something invisible. The line of her spine. The absolute confidence of her stillness between movements. None of it was for anyone. All of it was somehow, paradoxically, completely impossible to look away from. But her face was the thing. Because beneath everything she projected out into that room, somewhere beneath the composure and the grace and the absolute self-possession, there was something quiet living in her expression. Something careful. Something that had learned, a long time ago, to stay very still so that it wouldn't be seen. Soo-Hyun recognized it because he had spent years perfecting the same skill in himself. She was surviving something. Had been for a long time. Her eyes moved across the room in a brief scan, just for a second. Not afraid, just watchful. The way people are when they have learned that awareness is the only protection that always works. And in that brief second, Soo-Hyun saw everything he needed to see. And Han Soo-Hyun, who had read 1,000 men in 1,000 rooms, saw it immediately. For the first time in longer than he could remember. He forgot, for one moment, why he had walked into that room. He forgot about the 400 million. He forgot about Dae-Young. He forgot about the message that needed to be sent. The architecture that needed to be maintained. The certainty that needed to be preserved. One moment was all it took. Who is she? One of the club's dancers. Been here about a year. Keeps to herself. His man said it the way you say things about people who haven't done anything to warrant being talked about. Just facts. Just background. Soo-Hyun said nothing. He watched her for another beat. Keeps to herself. He understood that. He had spent a lifetime keeping to himself too. He understood the economics of it. The way you learn, after enough has happened to you, That the safest version of yourself is the smallest one, the one that takes up the least space, the one that asks for the least and gives away the least and stays at the edges of things where the damage tends to be lighter. He understood it completely. But there was something else pulling at him. Something he couldn't place yet. A thread at the very edge of his mind, thin and insistent. He was a man who dealt in information, who believed that every feeling had a factual basis if you traced it back far enough. This feeling had a basis. He just didn't have enough information yet to know what it was. He didn't follow threads. He cut them. Tonight. He couldn't find the scissors. And then the past arrived. Right on schedule. Park Dae-young was at a back table on the far side of the room. He had a drink in his hand, and he was laughing at something the man across from him had said. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man who had convinced himself the worst wasn't coming. Soo-Hyun watched him for a moment before Dae-young felt it, the way people always eventually feel the weight of being watched by certain eyes, and turned. His face went completely still. Then it drained. He rose from his seat slowly, chair scraping back. His eyes moved to the exits the way eyes do when the body is considering options the mind already knows are closed. His men were already there before Dae-young could take a single step. Time to go. The back room had a low ceiling, a single light hanging from a short cord. The walls were close. The sound of the club came through as just a muffled pulse, something from another world. The door closed behind them, and the silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that falls in rooms where serious things happen. This kind of room doesn't exist on any floor plan. Every club in the Port District had one. A room for conversations that don't leave. Dae-young stood in the center of it, and Soo-Hyun stood near the door, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. Dae-young was breathing fast. His hands were not steady. He had the look of a man whose body had already understood what his mind was still trying to negotiate its way around. He had been in a room like this before. On the other side of it. Standing where Soo-Hyun was standing now. He had watched men break in this kind of room. Had watched men say things they never thought they would say. He had never imagined being the one standing in the center. "Boss, please, I can—" "You stole from me." The words were so flat, so absent of heat. That was almost worse than if he had shouted them. Shouting would have meant emotion. Emotion meant a door. This was a wall. I know what I did. Then you know how this ends. Please, just let me explain. 1 minute. That's all I'm asking for. 1 minute. Soo-Hyun looked at him. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. But he didn't signal his men. He waited. And Dae-young, understanding that the wait was the only gift he was going to get, started talking. "It was for my sister. She's been working in this club for 14 months. I've been trying to get her out since the day she started. There's a man she owes money to. A lender, not the legal kind. He's been threatening her. The kind of threatening that doesn't stop. The kind that gets worse. I needed money fast. Real money. The kind I couldn't earn in time doing things the right way." He swallowed. "I should have come to you, I know that. I have known that every single day since I did it. I panicked. I saw her face when she called me and I panicked, and I made the worst decision of my life. And I have thought about nothing else since. Silence. Sister." The word sat in the room differently from everything else that had been said in it. Sister. Soo-Hyun's mind moved, the way it always moved, fast and clean and following the thread he had been unable to cut earlier in the evening. A woman who had been working in this club for 14 months. A woman who kept to herself. A woman whose eyes scanned every room she walked into because she had learned that awareness was the only protection that always worked. A woman who was surviving something. Of course. He stood there in that dim room and felt the entire evening rearrange itself around a single word. He had a code. It wasn't written anywhere. It had never needed to be. Every man who had ever worked for him understood it the way you understand gravity. You don't need someone to explain it to you. You simply know that it operates, that it is constant, and that ignoring it has consequences. You steal from the organization, you pay for it. No exceptions. No negotiations. No mercy. Because mercy reads as weakness, and weakness invites chaos, and chaos costs more than any individual decision ever could. This was not a feeling. It was a fact. He had seen what happened to organizations that bent their own rules. He had watched them slowly lose their shape, lose their authority, lose the respect that was the only real currency any of this ran on. He had promised himself, a long time ago, that he would never let sentiment make him sloppy. Every rational part of him said to proceed. Make an example. Protect the structure. Hold the line that had held everything together for 17 years. And then something irrational happened. He thought about her face. Not deliberately. Not as a calculation. It just arrived, unbidden and specific. The way she had looked when her eyes briefly scanned the room. The weight she carried that she had learned to make invisible. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding something heavy alone for a very long time. He thought about what it would mean for her, tomorrow, if he proceeded tonight. Boss, your call. The room waited. His men waited. Dae-Young waited with his eyes closed, like a man who has already made his peace with whatever comes next. Soo-Hyun stood in the silence for what felt like a very long time. Stand up. Dae-Young opened his eyes. What? I said stand up. He stood, slowly, like someone who doesn't fully trust what they're hearing, like a man rising from a ledge he thought he was going to fall from. Take your sister. Leave Incheon. Don't come back. The bodyguard to his left made a small involuntary sound. Not quite a protest. Just the noise of a man whose understanding of how the world works has just been disturbed. You heard me? The men in that room had seen a lot. They had been in dozens of rooms like this one. They had watched Soo-Hyun make decisions that were clean and final and absolute. They had never seen this. He looked at Dae-Young, and the look said everything the words didn't need to. I will not say it again. A beat. A single slow breath. Dae-Young's face did something complicated. Relief and grief and shame moving through it all at once. But when he spoke, his voice had lost the shaking. But it had also lost something else. Some quality that belonged to a younger version of himself that this night had finished off permanently. Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you. He left. The door closed. And Soo-Hyun stood alone in the quiet of the back room with the single light and the muffled pulse of the club coming through the walls and the absolute certainty that he had just done something he could not explain. The most feared man in the city. Let a thief walk out of that room breathing. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he walked out. He didn't examine it. He was a man who dealt in certainties, in structures, in things that could be measured and calculated and controlled. What he had just done had no certain explanation. It had no precedent in the 17 years he had been doing this. It didn't fit the architecture he had built everything on. He wasn't ready to name what it did fit. Not yet. 3 days passed. He sat in his office on the 42nd floor and handled business. He took meetings with men who needed things from him and dispensed decisions with the same quiet efficiency he always did. He reviewed numbers. He signed off on arrangements. He ate alone at his desk most evenings because eating had always been just a practical matter to him. Fuel, not pleasure, not company. He was present in every room he entered. And every night when the city went dark and quiet outside his window, she was there. Not in the way a fantasy arrives. Not with heat or wanting. Just as a presence. A specific, detailed, an unmistakable presence at the back of his mind that he could not dissolve no matter how much he focused on other things. The way she moved like the room was a backdrop, the careful eyes that scanned without fear, the weight she was carrying that she had learned to make look like nothing. The word her brother had used, the word that had rearranged the entire evening, the word that had cost Soo-Hyun his certainty for the first time in 17 years. He kept returning to her face, not because he wanted to, because he couldn't stop. He understood her. That was the part that wouldn't leave him alone. In a life where he had rarely understood anyone fully, where people had always required translation, she had been instantly legible to him. He had read her in 30 seconds across a crowded room, had understood the structure of what she was carrying without a single word. He had never had that experience before, and he didn't know what to do with it. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself it was the unsatisfying incompleteness of an evening that had ended strangely, a pattern interrupted, a loose end that his mind wanted to tie off. He told himself he was simply a man who didn't like unresolved things. He told himself a lot of things. On the fourth night, he went back. No business, no target, no guards trailing him at a respectful distance. He drove himself, which he almost never did, and parked 2 streets away and walked to the club entrance like anyone else would. Like a man with no particular authority and no particular agenda. No reason he would admit to. Just a man walking towards something he didn't have a name for yet. The club was exactly the same as it had been 4 nights ago. The same bass-heavy music, the same low lighting, the same particular energy of a place that runs on the willingness of people to forget, for a few hours, whatever they need to forget. He walked in without anyone noticing, which was unusual, and found a place near the back where he could see the stage. And there she was. Like the 4 days hadn't happened. Like she existed outside the normal movement of time, showing up in the same warm spotlight, moving the same way, utterly self-contained, utterly unreachable. Something in his chest settled in a way it hadn't settled in 4 days. He hated that. He hated how specific it was. He hated that it was about her specifically. This woman he had never spoken to. This woman he knew nothing about beyond 30 seconds of observation and one devastating word spoken by her brother in a dim back room. He hated that he had come back. He stayed near the back and watched her finish her set. Watched her step down from the stage with the same contained grace she brought to everything. Not rushed. Not performing the transition. Just moving from one space into the next. He crossed the room before he could think about it too carefully. Not fast. Steady. The way he did everything. She was standing near the edge of the stage when he stopped a few feet from her. Close enough to speak without raising his voice. Far enough to make it clear he wasn't crowding her. She looked at him directly. Not with the deference people usually showed him. Not with the particular shudder that came down in people's eyes when they were around someone powerful and were trying to calculate how to handle it. She just looked at him. Level. Curious. Careful without being afraid. "Can I talk to you?" "That depends on what you want to say." She had a low voice. Steady. The voice of someone who had learned that how you say something matters as much as what you say. He stood there in the noise and light of that room and felt, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely uncertain about what came next. He who had always known what came next. He who had made a career, made a life, out of being 3 steps ahead of every room he entered. No guards behind him, no role to play, no version of himself constructed for the purpose of the moment. Just him, standing in front of a woman who was looking at him like she intended to see whatever was actually there. And the truth came out of his mouth before he could decide whether it was the right thing to say. "I'm the man who let your brother go home to you." The music kept playing around them. The room kept moving. But between the two of them, the air went completely still. Her eyes changed. Not dramatically. not with the theatrical shock of someone in a story. Just a quiet, precise shift, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting for years for the right key to arrive. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the entire complicated truth of the last 4 days sat between them like something alive. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing a man like him can do is tell the truth. To be continued. If you want to watch more stories like this one, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because part 2 drops very soon, and trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next between these two.